So I'm just wondering, before we start here, does anybody have an inclination about how old the Grand Canyon is? No, that's why you're here tonight. 3 million, did I hear? 3 weeks. You weren't here 3 weeks ago, and if you weren't here and you didn't see it, it must not have been here. Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the age of the Grand Canyon tonight, but as you're going to hear, it can be very difficult to define what is the beginning of the Grand Canyon. So we're all here at this fantastic national park. This is the postcard view of the Grand Canyon right here. And surprisingly, working as a geologist and a guide here at the Grand Canyon, so many people get to the edge and they want to know, how did this form and when did it form? So this might have been you today. You might have been out at the rim of the Grand Canyon. And I'm just curious, did anybody have that thought in their mind about how did it form or when did it form? Yeah, I can see a few people raising their hands there. How many people didn't have that thought? Oh, there's one brave person in the back there. That's good. You didn't, okay. Well, this is what a lot of people do when they come to the Grand Canyon. They like to have a contemplative moment in front of it. And geologists have been very busy for about 150 years trying to answer those two questions. How did the Grand Canyon form? What is the mechanism that formed the Grand Canyon? When you look down and you can see the Colorado River at the bottom, when did it form the Grand Canyon? And this is a question that is currently undergoing a lot of scrutiny right now because of new laboratory techniques that geologists have developed to be able to tease information out of the rocks that they haven't been able to do before. So if we were to just give you a simple answer to those two questions, we could say that the Colorado River carved the Grand Canyon. But I want to bring to your attention that little asterisk right after that statement. And if we wanted to answer the age of the Grand Canyon, the most commonly cited age is 6 million years. And by the way, when you see this abbreviation tonight, capital M, small a, that stands for mega annum, and that's a way to make it so that on my photographic slide I don't have to write out millions of years ago. Mega annum means millions of years ago. So those two asterisks stand for the fact that the Colorado River is responsible for the Grand Canyon, but the Colorado River has not always looked the way that it does today. And the fact that most geologists believe that the age of the river and the age of the canyon is 6 million years, there still is a controversy that maybe parts of the canyon, either with respect to its depth or the length of it, formed at earlier times. And that's why it can be difficult to know how old it is. So there is still some debate. And believe it or not, the age estimates for the age of the Grand Canyon range from 70 to 6 million years ago. And you think to yourself, how can there be a factor of 11 that we don't know, 6 million years or 70 million years? And it's not for a lack of trying. There's a big prize at the end of the rainbow to the geologist who can figure out exactly how and when the Grand Canyon formed. But so far that has proven a little bit elusive. The Grand Canyon was in the news recently on January 25th. This article came out in Nature from England, and then it was popularized here in the Science News magazine. There were some researchers from the University of New Mexico who put forward a brand new idea that combines old ages with young ages, and National Geographic, if you go online, has also been doing the same thing. And it seems like once every 18 months lately, the Grand Canyon makes the national news because it's such an iconic landscape, and yet there's still debate about how and when it formed. So tonight we're just going to discuss a few things. One of the things that I have found of interest as I've done my geologic studies is that a geologic perspective was needed before any human being could appreciate the Grand Canyon. And I'm going to give you some examples of people who came to the Grand Canyon before geology was even invented, and you'll see what their reaction to this landscape was. A very brief history of ideas, how geologists have looked at the formation of the Grand Canyon through time, How did the Colorado River accomplish the task of carving the canyon? How does a river actually cut down into solid rock? And when the river might have carved the Grand Canyon. Those are the four things that we're going to talk about tonight. By the way, this is a view of the bottom of the Grand Canyon along the Colorado River. From most viewpoints on the South Rim, you can't even see the river, and that's because of this very steep inner gorge composed of very hard metamorphic and igneous rocks. But I have noticed that it wasn't until the Grand Canyon was appreciated or known geologically could it be truly appreciated aesthetically. And I'm going to give you a few examples about that. For about 500 years now, a lot of conquistadors, fur trappers, and miners have been coming to the Grand Canyon, and they had nothing good to say about it. And maybe if you got caught in a traffic jam coming in at the entrance station, you might not have anything good to say about it either until you get to the edge of it right there and you can see what it looks like. The first Europeans to ever see the Grand Canyon came in August of 1540. That was less than 50 years after Christopher Columbus had sailed to the Bahama Islands, quote unquote, discovering the New World. In less than 50 years, Spanish conquistadors were already at the rim of the Grand Canyon. And listen to what Pedro Castaneda had to say about it. From the top, the men could make out, apart from the canyon, some small boulders which seemed to be as high as a man. Those who went down and who reached them swore that they were taller than the great Tower of Seville. So here are these Europeans. There's nothing on the European landscape that's anything like the Grand Canyon. What's the only thing they could compare it to was this teeny little tower in Spain. And in the year 1540, the Tower of Seville was 282 feet tall. This is what it looked like through various incarnations of its development. And if you were to put the Tower of Seville inside the Grand Canyon, there it is. I have shrunk down that picture of the tower, and if you're having trouble seeing it, there's the Tower of Seville in the Grand Canyon. These are the first Europeans. They don't have anything on that landscape to compare this with, and so they're totally lost in the landscape. When they looked down from the top at the Colorado River, they thought the river was 6 feet wide. It's actually about 300 feet wide. And just to have some fun, let's put 6 towers of Sevilles in the Grand Canyon and just see how small it is. That's that same picture of the tower. I've just shrunk it down on this digital photograph right there. It's meaningless to compare it to that. If we move up to the year 1826, there was an American fur trapper named James Ohio Patty. And by the way, if you take nothing else away from the lecture tonight, read the narrative of James Ohio Patty. He wrote about his travels 6 years in the American West from 1826 to 1831. It's a fabulous read. Well, listen to what James Ohio Patty had to say. On the 28th, we reached a point where the mountains shut in so close upon the river that we were compelled to climb and travel along the acclivity with the river still in sight at an immense depth beneath us. It is perhaps this very long and formidable range of mountains which has caused the country of the Red River to have not been explored more thoroughly by Americans. A march more gloomy and heart-weary cannot be imagined. After 14 days, we arrive where the river emerges from these horrid mountains. Do you think James Ohio Patty feels inclined to like the Grand Canyon? For 14 days, he walked along the south rim from the very western edge to the eastern edge and had nothing good to say about it. This type of attitude towards the Grand Canyon continued until just before the Civil War, and this man here, Lieutenant Christmas Ives, is probably the last American to see the canyon and have this disinclined view to it. He had this very famous quote in his report to Congress. "The region is, of course, altogether valueless. It can be approached only from the south, and after entering it, there is nothing to do but leave. Ours has been the first and will doubtless be the last party of whites to visit this profitless locality. It seems intended by nature that the Colorado River along the greater portion of its lonely and majestic way shall be forever unvisited and undisturbed." How wrong can you be about a landscape? We get 4.5 million visitors a year, and yet when he was looking at it, he was a farmer from New Hampshire. He probably wondered why the Indians didn't rotate their crops when he looked down in this giant gorge. He was very much disinclined. And so, truthfully, a geologic perspective was really needed. And I bring this up because all of these Europeans that came here before this time, they wrote things like this about the Grand Canyon. And then the very first geologist to ever see it couldn't have written anything more spectacular about it. He said, though dreaded and shunned by the adventurer, the miner, and the immigrant, the Colorado Plateau is to the geologist a paradise. It has the most splendid exposure of stratified rocks in the whole world. And that was the first geologist, and every geologist who saw it after that came back at least twice. So that's when the change happened, about 1860. Just thinking about those old miners and everything, imagine if there had been gold or silver or platinum or lead or zinc in the bottom of the Grand Canyon. Imagine if these minerals had been found in those ancient rocks at the bottom of the canyon. Think how different the human history at Grand Canyon would be. And I think it's fortunate for all of us that these minerals were not found there, because the Grand Canyon was left kind of alone so that we could enjoy it as a national park. So before we go too much farther into the lecture, let's just differentiate between the age of rocks and the age of the hole in the ground. The rocks that we see very much accentuated in the snowfall right here in the walls of Grand Canyon, we're talking about geologic histories that go back hundreds of millions of years, when this was a landscape that would be totally unrecognizable as the one we see today. It was very flat and featureless, and all of those horizontal lines you see in the walls of the Grand Canyon, at one time in the geologic past, that was the surface of the earth, and sediment was being spread out across the landscape. This is long before the Grand Canyon existed, but its rocks were starting to accumulate. And we have evidence for how old these rocks are by looking at things like these fossils you can find in some of the limestone rocks. Occasionally there'll be volcanic ash that's embedded with these sedimentary rocks, and they can be dated radiometrically in a laboratory. And so it turns out that we're talking hundreds of millions of years ago. And one of the books that we're going to have at the book signing after the lecture tonight is a book that is a compendium of all of these ancient maps. You can see the outlines of the four corner states right here. But look at this ancient landscape that was here 270 million years ago. All of this light-colored blue represents shallow marine water that inundated this part of the world. And look at where the land of North America was, right there in Utah and Colorado and Wyoming. By the way, just to place the modern landscape there for you, let's put Grand Canyon Village and the modern Grand Canyon right there in the middle of that sea. This is the start of the Grand Canyon, this is the end, and that red dot is the Shrine of the Ages, where you're sitting tonight. So that's what you would have been in 270 million years ago. And it turns out that the Kaibab limestone is the youngest layer that sits in the Grand Canyon. It sits on top of all of this. And when you're walking on that ancient seafloor right there, that tells you that the Grand Canyon has to be younger than this age. You cannot have the sea there and have the Grand Canyon there. So right there, the limit of age for the Grand Canyon is 270 million. But if we were to drive around to the north rim today, we would go right past these rocks, up near Lee's Ferry and Lake Powell. You can see the top part of the Grand Canyon right here. But look at all of these rocks that sit on top of the Kaibab limestone. Did you know that those rocks used to also be here as well? Those rocks were once here, present at Grand Canyon, but you got here too late to see them. If you want to see them today, you can go to Zion National Park, and all those rocks you see in the top part of the photograph make up the walls of Zion Canyon. So here's a diagram from the Ancient Landscapes book. And all of the rocks that we can see at Grand Canyon can be found in this stack right here. But these rocks used to exist here. And they have already been eroded away. In fact, let's just remove those rocks. Those are strata already eroded from Grand Canyon. And as Marker mentioned, I just got to hike out from the bottom of the Grand Canyon today. And we started at 6:30 this morning down here at the Colorado River. And 8 hours later, we had made our way all the way up to there. And I turned to my group when we got to the top and I said, be thankful you didn't do this hike 70 million years ago. We'd still have to climb up through all of this. I mean, they did it at the right time. They only had a mile to come out instead of 3 miles to come out. So the purpose of this is to show you that this strata used to also be here. And when we look to the north to that strata, this is what the ancient geography looked like. Again, there's Grand Canyon Village and the Colorado River. And you can see that just 90 million years ago, Grand Canyon Village was located just offshore of this ancient beach that was full of dinosaurs that used to go along this coastal plain. So 90 million years ago, the Grand Canyon could not have been possible. This is what these rocks look like. There's a shark's tooth right up there. Shark tooth are just full of this black shale right here that was deposited in that ocean. And what that means is that the Grand Canyon has to be younger than 90 million years. We had an ocean here at that time. So just a very quick survey of the history of ideas. These geologists that came through here and started to tell the world that this was a landscape worth preserving, worth understanding. This is a picture of the first geologist to ever see the Grand Canyon. This is the man who said it was a paradise and had the most splendid exposure of strata in the whole world, John Strong Newberry. And he made the very first fundamental observation about the Grand Canyon. And this is the diagram from his book. You can see this cross-section of the Grand Canyon. And what he noticed is that when he looked from one side of the canyon to the other, the layers were not offset by faulting. And he made what was then the radical notion that it was carved exclusively by the action of the Colorado River. And that was really a novel thought in that day, that a river could carve a canyon as deep as the Grand Canyon. That is still one of the most fundamental facts about the Grand Canyon. It's not a giant fault or fissure where a crack in the earth has opened up and the river later occupied that valley. Something like that could be found at the Rio Grande River in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where the Rio Grande Rift has opened up and the river has occupied that down-faulted valley. Not here at the Grand Canyon. These layers were just totally connected across there before the river carved out the canyon. The very next geologist to see it is probably somebody you've heard about, the one-armed Civil War veteran, John Wesley Powell. He was the first geologist to go down the river. Here's a picture taken from his second expedition. You can see his chair lashed down to this wooden boat. And here they are in the depths of Grand Canyon. They went 99 days in 1869 from Green River, Wyoming, almost all the way to where Las Vegas, Nevada is today. And along the way, Major Powell was making scientific observations about the geology of the canyon. And he came up with this theory that he said that the river was already in its present course. You can see it there on a very subdued landscape. But then when the Earth's crust was squeezed and compressed, the mountains rose up around the river, but it happened slow enough that it didn't divert the river out of its channel. And this is a theory that he invented a name for called antecedence, whereby the river is on the landscape before the mountains are formed. It turns out that this is probably not entirely correct for the Grand Canyon, but it was an initial observation about how it could have formed. And John Wesley Powell invited many other geologists to come later. This is Clarence Dutton, and he was the geologist who saw the Grand Canyon for the first time from the north side. He had a little bit of a different idea called superposition, in which the river flows on very soft lake sediments, but these lake sediments are burying an older topography. And as that river starts to slice down through the soft lake sediments, it eventually re-exposes this old topography and can cut canyons through that exhumed landscape. Maybe this is something that caused the Grand Canyon, but what you see going on here is that the more geologists look at the landscape, they're seeing slightly different things within it. William Morris Davis came here right after the turn of the 20th century. In the year 1901, he took a 27-day buggy ride from Flagstaff, Arizona to Milford, Utah, and looked down into the Grand Canyon. and made what I think is one of the most fundamental observations about the Colorado River. Now here's a picture of the Colorado River at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. This is at Phantom Ranch, and this is Bright Angel Creek coming into the Colorado River. And you can see this huge fan of boulders that has pushed the river up against this wall right here. By the way, there's the bridge that goes across the river that brings all of the fresh water to the south rim. Every drop of water you drink up here comes from the north side of the canyon. What William Morris Davis observed is that just about every single side stream enters the Colorado River at grade. There is no waterfall pouring into the Colorado River. And what he observed is that even a stream that small has carved a canyon back up in here just as deep as the Grand Canyon. And this is true even for streams that don't have water in them. Totally dry streams, except when it rains and floods, all come into the Colorado River at grade. And what you should be thinking about in your seat there, how can that be? How can a side stream that virtually has no water in it carve a canyon just as deep as the Colorado? The answer is that it's not water that carves canyons. It's the boulders that are moved in big floods. These are the things that do the chiseling. And whenever a big flood comes down a side stream, it is moving boulders the size of buses and houses. And those boulders physically roll on those dry stream beds and chip away at the bedrock. This is how the Colorado River carved the Grand Canyon. And if you had come to a talk like this maybe 50 years ago, you would have heard the rangers say that it is the sand and silt in the Colorado River that slowly wears away the bedrock like sandpaper on a piece of wood. And we found out that that couldn't be true because when we look at the river channel, there's almost 100 feet of sand and gravel sitting on the bedrock. The river never even touches the bedrock, and so the Grand Canyon today is not getting any deeper. That doesn't mean that it won't get deeper in the future, it will. These are the things that carve canyons right there. Water does not carve canyons, but the material that it moves does. Now, as we move into the 20th century, Elliott Blackwelder really went against the grain, and he was the first geologist to propose that the Colorado River was young. And he thought that it might be just 2 to 6 million years old for the river. John Wesley Powell thought it might be 70 million years old. And Elliott Blackwelder's idea was that as water made its way from the Rocky Mountains, it would fill up a lake basin, and when that lake basin would fill with water, it would spill over a low point and then create another lake downstream. And that same process would happen, and you'd get a lake here. And you can see this spillover effect happening all the way down. And Elliott Blackwelder's idea is that all the way from the Rocky Mountains, you would have a chain of lakes, and as they progressively filled with water, they would spill over their lowest rim, moving to the next basin, and once that basin filled with water, all the way to the Gulf of California. And it turns out, I'll show you in just a moment, that this idea has been resurrected in just the last 10 years. Chester Longwell showed that the Colorado River could be no older than 6 million years as it exited Grand Canyon. And let me show you a picture of what it looks like where Grand Canyon ends. This is not too far from Las Vegas, Nevada. You can see the Colorado River coming out right here. This is a picture of Lake Mead behind Hoover Dam. That's when there actually used to be water behind Hoover Dam. This picture is about 25 years old. But that's the channel of the old Colorado River right there. And this is the end of the Grand Canyon right there. Well, what we want to do is look at all of this gravel that sits around the former river channel. And when you look at that gravel, that's called the Muddy Creek Formation, and there's absolutely no Colorado River sediment within that deposit. And that deposit is as young as 6 million years old. And that means that the Colorado River was not in place right there when all of that gravel was being deposited across it. If you want to see where this gravel came from, I'm just going to wash the gravel in from the west. There's the gravel being deposited before the Colorado River was there. There was also a sheet of gravel that came out of that canyon. There's that fan coming out right there. And then later, the Colorado River started to slice through those deposits. So this is where the age 6 million years comes from for the Grand Canyon, right here. It all comes from the very end of the Grand Canyon, down there at the Grand Wash Cliffs. And then finally, the last historic idea we want to talk about was with Eddie McKee, who showed that the Colorado River could have been formed from two separate rivers that then attached themselves to one another. And this was the idea of a polyphase river, a river that formed from two separate ancestors. And here I've used Photoshop to remove where we are in the Grand Canyon right here. And the idea that McKee is that there was one river that existed over here and another river that existed over here. And let me just show you that river right there. That's a river that may have gone over to the Rio Grande in that direction. And then this other river went towards the Gulf of California, and you can see the direction that it would flow out that way. And right here where we are tonight, in this part of Grand Canyon, there was no canyon at that time. This was the headwaters of this stream right here. But eventually that stream lengthened its channel until it intercepted that other river that may have gone to the Rio Grande. And once it did that, it could deepen the Grand Canyon right there. And then we ended up with the river that came down those two channels and then went out to the Gulf of California that way. This was a huge leap of insight because for the first time, geologists had proposed that rivers have a history, rivers have ancestors that give us the rivers that we have today. There's nothing to say that the rivers we see on the landscape today have always been there in the form that we see them. So this is how geologists resolve the debate right here. They put on their boxing gloves, and we have one geologist who says it's an old canyon, and we have another geologist who says it's a young canyon. And at a meeting we had in Flagstaff in 2010, this was a lighter moment when the geologists decided to put on their boxing gloves. It's actually not like this. When geologists get together, they love to share ideas, but they also vigorously debate them. So what is the evidence for the canyon being 70 million years old? Let me just give you two lines of evidence. It is well recognized by most geologists that an ancient drainage system once flowed in the opposite direction that the Colorado River goes today. And some geologists have pointed out that that ancient river system may have carved an early incarnation of the Grand Canyon. There are also some deeply cut side canyons in portions of the Grand Canyon that contain gravel that show that these rivers were going in the opposite direction. So if you look at this map of the Four Corner states, this map would have shown what things were like about 70 million years ago. Again, the red dot shows where we are tonight. And 70 million years ago, there were mountains where Tucson and Phoenix and Las Vegas and Salt Lake City are located, and the lowlands were off in this direction before the Rocky Mountains formed. And just watch which way the drainages went at this time. Drainage went to the northeast before the Rocky Mountains were uplifted. That's exactly the opposite direction that the river goes today. And sometimes people will ask, Wayne, where did all that dirt go that used to be in the Grand Canyon? Most of it is sitting in the Gulf of California from the modern Colorado River, but there could be a portion of it that's sitting in the Gulf of Mexico offshore from New Orleans. Here's this side canyon in the Grand Canyon, and look at this gravel deposit that sits in here. These are some of the layers that are deepest down in the Grand Canyon on the Yavapai Indian Reservation. They're about 50 to 60 million years old. And here's the evidence right here that a giant canyon was cut and was being partially filled by gravel in a river that was going to the north in that direction. Now, you can't drive to a place like this to see that gravel, and if you could see it, you probably wouldn't know what you were looking at anyway. But this is a very key deposit for the evidence for an old Grand Canyon. What would be the evidence for a canyon that's exclusively young? The sediment from the Grand Canyon did not exit until after 5.3 million years ago. I've already showed you that evidence from the Grand Wash Cliffs. And also the lower Colorado River was likely born only 5 million years ago. The lower Colorado River goes from Hoover Dam to the Gulf of California. And I'm going to show you some recent evidence. This is a brand new theory in the last 10 years. You can see some cities here on the modern landscape. There's Las Vegas, Nevada, Needles, California, Parker, Arizona, and Blythe, California. All of these towns, with the exception of Las Vegas, are located along the lower Colorado River, but notice there is no river on this ancient landscape about 5 million years ago. And what these geologists have found is that there's a series of deposits. Here they are at Laughlin, Nevada. These deposits may be the record for when the lower Colorado River was born. And just in the last 10 or 15 years, they've been studying these deposits, and they show how this part of the river was formed by basin spillover. So here's this same map again, and watch what we're going to do over about a 1 million year period. This is what the deposits are telling us. The Colorado River came out of the area where the Grand Canyon is now located, and then came up against a bedrock dam. This would have been a natural mountain barrier, and it blocked that river in such a way that it created a freshwater lake. These lake deposits exist there. And then once this lake filled with water, it began to spill over the bedrock dam and completely destroyed it, and then that lake drained until it went to downstream to the next bedrock dam, which then formed another lake. That dam was overtopped, the lake disappeared, and the river went down to the next bedrock dam, and you've got the idea now. There's the third freshwater lake. Eventually that water spilled over the dam, that lake drained, and we had our final lake, the largest lake, which covered huge portions of the Mojave Desert. And when that water spilled over the bedrock dam, the lake drained, and we are left with the lower Colorado River forming the boundary between the modern states of California and Arizona. And it looks like these geologists from the University of Arizona have figured out how the lower Colorado River formed, and it turns out that Elliott Blackwelder was right, at least for this portion of the river. And when the geologists finished this study, they looked back upstream from here, and they figuratively and literally asked the question, what was the cause of all this rapid arrival of river water to these lower river basins? And it could be that maybe headward erosion and stream capture, like we showed you previously, was delivering this water in a rapid sense geologically. If you go to near the Salton Sea, you can see these fantastic deposits in Anza Borrego State Park, and it's within this section of rock that the layers below have no Colorado River sediment, and you go across one horizon, and all of a sudden you start to see sand grains from the Rocky Mountains. And right in that outcrop there is a horizon that shows the Colorado River began to arrive at the Gulf of California. Well, here's the present day drainage. This is a much different landscape than the previous map I showed you, and this is the way that the Colorado River flows today, right past Grand Canyon Village and off to the Gulf of California. This is the river that we have today. This is the river that has created this fantastic landscape, and for all those fantastic parks that you may have visited up in Utah or Colorado and New Mexico, that landscape as well has been carved by this river. So I know you'll probably leave the lecture and you might say to yourself, so how old is the Grand Canyon? What should we say? Is it 70 million or is it 6 million? Well, I like to think of it as maybe it's equivalent to the old legend about the 6 blind men and the elephant. And in case you've forgotten that, 6 blind men were each examining a different part of the elephant. And the elephant is a pillar, said the first man, touching his leg. Oh no, said the second, who touched its tail. It's a rope. Not really, said the third man, who touched the trunk. It's like the thick branch of a tree. Wrong, it's like a big hand of a fan, said the fourth man, who touched the ear of the elephant. It's like a huge wall, said the fifth man, who touched the belly. Nope, it's like a solid pipe, said the sixth man, who touched the tusk of the elephant. They began to argue, and each insisted that they were right. A woman passing by saw this and asked them what was the matter. They said, "We cannot agree what the elephant is." The woman calmly explained, "All of you are right. The reason you are telling it differently is because each of you touched a different part of it. Actually, the elephant has all of those things, and you are all right." And it could be that the Grand Canyon is such a large landscape feature that it has taken a long time for we little humans to really get our head around it, to really get our arms around it. There's so many parts to the Grand Canyon. There's nobody who's ever been to all parts of the Grand Canyon. No geologist who's seen every outcrop of rocks. There's still secrets being discovered about the Grand Canyon, and things will change. This is the paper that came out just on January 25th. And the workers on this paper, prior to this time, had been proponents of an exclusively young canyon, who would have said that if you came here 6 million years ago, you could have walked across this flat surface all the way to where the North Rim is. And just on January 25th, they came out and said, it looks like parts of the Grand Canyon were formed a long time ago. They looked at the canyon and saw 5 different parts to it. One of the parts was 25 million years old, and another part was 70 million years old. And this is starting to resemble the legend of the 6 men and the elephant, where you touch different parts of it and you get different ages. So perhaps the problem really that we don't have an answer, a definitive answer for the age of the Grand Canyon, is really just one of semantics. How do you define what the beginning of a big landscape feature is? There's no agreement as to what the beginning might be. So if you take that drive to Lee's Ferry and you go past Navajo Bridge, you are going to see an outcrop where the Kaibab limestone that forms the rim of the Grand Canyon is just 25 feet deep right there. Now, if you could go back 6 million years ago or 70 million years ago and you saw the Colorado River or one of its ancestors beginning to cut down into the Kaibab limestone 25 feet, would you call that the Grand Canyon? I bet you there are very few people who would call it the Grand Canyon, and yet that might be the beginning of it. What about if only a portion of the Grand Canyon, I've photoshopped all of the Grand Canyon out right here, what if only that portion of the Grand Canyon began to be cut 70 million years ago, a mere 40-mile stretch, where the lateral extent was only 40 miles? Could you call that the start of the Grand Canyon? Even though there's no Grand Canyon here yet, it's still all flat terrain? You can see there's kind of a problem with semantics. So the answer to the question, how old is the Grand Canyon, may be 6 million years with that asterisk right there. And I hope the park brochures will include that asterisk at some point in the future until we finish it. And I want you to think back to when you're at home and you're not on vacation and you're watching the evening news and you see all of those ads for the pharmaceutical drugs they want us to take for all of our ailments. And then that man talks very rapidly about all of the things that might happen when you take that. Well, that's what I'm going to do right now. Your results may vary. Consult your own personal geologist for specific answers to certain questions. Having one geologist is a blessing. 2 of them may cause arguments. Use caution. And of course, I'm exaggerating a little bit. It is interesting to be involved in this debate about how old is the Grand Canyon. And I know there's at least one other geologist in the room, and we were both talking on the trail today about how fun it is to live at a time when we don't know all the answers for how the Grand Canyon got here. Some people might think, oh, that's so uncomfortable, we should have an answer for it. But really, to live at this time where we don't have all the answers is really kind of neat. The important thing is that we continue to search for an answer, and the pace of research that's going on in this park is really picking up because of new laboratory techniques, new findings that lead to new questions. It's a really exciting time to be here, and I think that really it's the journey of discovery and not so much the destination that makes this inquiry exciting and interesting. And I hope tonight you've been a little bit inspired about this mystery that still exists. I do want to say that there is a lot that is known about the formation of the canyon. There is a lot that is known about the geology of Grand Canyon. You shouldn't think that because there's a debate that some things are not right with the research angles that are being taken. There is a lot that is being discovered right now, and thank you all for being so interested in it. These are the 2 books that I'll be signing just right outside, and if you'd like to have a signed copy, I'd be happy to do that for you. Thank you all very much.